teaches geography at the HillCountry University Center, and he's a member of the OLLI board, and he's taught various OLLI classes for us. I'm sure some of you have been to some of his classes today, before. I'll let you take it from there, Ross.
Okay, thank you, Alice. Our topic today is the summer of 1968 that changed baseball. And so hopefully you are either baseball fans or historians that know something about 1968. We're going to start with the slideshow. Can everybody see the slideshow? If you cannot see it, let Alice know. We have the first slide up there.
Randall,
Can
how
you
do I
see
turn
it?
up the volume?
I can't hear. What was that?
Could everybody please remain muted until
Can you see the
until you need to talk?
if you can't? Yeah, okay. All right, well, let's begin the show. All right.
I feel like I have it, but I'll keep listening.
The summer that changed baseball and a whole lot more. This is a story about baseball. 1968 was a watershed year for baseball, but for other sports and for our country. Remember back that time, over 50 years ago, rocked by tragedy in America, sweeping changes were taking place in the sports and in the country. I've been to the mountaintop was Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech the day before he was assassinated in Memphis. From the beginning, 68 was a season when opening day was postponed, played in the shadow of the funeral of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm taking those words from the book that inspired this talk, which I read a couple of years ago by Tim Wendell, called The Summer of 68. 68 for baseball was known as the year of the pitcher. The World Series pitted the National League St. Louis Cardinals against the Detroit Tigers in October of that year. And I have to tell you that I have been a lifelong Detroit Tiger fan, so you'll get a little perspective distortion from that fact. What else was going on in 1968? The war in Vietnam, political upheaval, racial unrest in America. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were assassinated in April and June of that year, respectively. There were protests all over Europe, Czechoslovakia, France. The presidential election took place, Nixon against Humphrey. Women's lib, the Olympic Games in France, and later in Mexico. We'll talk about those in detail, or a little bit more. And then the trip to the moon on Christmas Eve. What changed in baseball? Major League Baseball wanted more home runs and hitting. Up through 1968, of course, called the year of the pitcher, the pitchers were dominant over the hitters. The batting title in 1967 was in the American League was 300, batting 300. And of course, baseball fans will know that 300 is pretty common nowadays and has been since then, actually. And a couple of hitters, of course, since then have actually batted 400. So there was a lot less hitting. Defensive fielding, base running, the old-fashioned baseball, which had been going on since the 1800s, began to wane. After 1968, Major League Baseball lowered the pitcher's mound only 6 inches, but hitters could see the difference because it looked like dominant pitchers, like the ones we'll talk about in a minute, were right on top of them. And to compensate for that, they decreased the strike zone. It was from the shoulders to the bottom of the knees. And then in 1969, they changed that to the armpits to the top of the knees to compensate a little bit for lowering the pitching mound. Major League Baseball expansion took place the following year. So 68 was the end of an era. It was the end of the era that was dominated by pitchers. New teams came in, Seattle and Kansas City in the American League, and Montreal and San Diego in the National League. And that was just the beginning of the expansion of baseball to other parts. So 68 was the watershed. Pitching complete games was replaced with more relievers. Relievers were considered only an add-on if you couldn't get through the pitch a complete game by 1968. There were the first rumblings of free agency, which didn't take place until many years later, which involved giving players the right to decide where they played. Heretofore, through 1968, the owners of the teams decided who played where, and they could be traded without any involvement of the players at all. So free agency started. And then because of television, the national pastime really shifted from baseball to football. Television accommodated football much more readily because there was a lot of action going on. Baseball, of course, good for radio, good for people sitting in the stands, but kind of boring compared to football. So the national pastime really began changing at that time. We'll say more about that in a minute.
Ross,
The year of the pitcher. Yes.
you had a question from
Is there
Colleen.
a question?
Yes, she wanted to know if the strike
Yes.
zone changed for college, Babe Ruth in the Little League. I'm sorry.
Oh, I don't know. I suspect so. That's a good question. I don't know the answer. What happens usually is that it goes from the top down, as it does in any sport. So when they start changing it for the major leagues doesn't take effect right away. So it would be an interesting thing to pursue to find out the answer to that question. It's a good question.
Do you
I
want
suspect
me to
it
let you
took
know the
place,
chat
but
regional?
later on.
I'm sorry.
I can't hear you. What?
Do you want me to tell you the questions as they occur or wait till the end or?
That's all right. No, you can ask. You might as well ask as you go along. I guess everybody's muted except me. So you go ahead, Alice, and let us know.
Yes. They can
Everybody.
unmute us.
All right. The year of the pitcher in the American League, the Detroit Tiger Denny McLain won an amazing 31 games for Tigers. For baseball fans, we know that winning 20 games was kind of the standard that we look to today. And some people, of course, get into the high 20s, but Denny McLain actually won 31 games. In the National League, the dominant player considered kind of the gold standard of pitching was Bob Gibson. Despite the fact that he had probably more dominance than any other pitcher, he won 21 games, which is great, with the earned run average of 1.12, which is incredible. Usually if you're in the 2 to 3 to 4 range, you're considered a very good pitcher. He pitched 17 complete games in 1968 during the season. And they say that the reason that he didn't win more games is that the St. Louis Cardinals were the kind of the basic baseball team that scored very few runs, but could beat you with their speed on the bases, their amazing fielding, and their dominant pitching. And so he didn't get the run support that Denny McLain did. The Tigers averaged about 3 runs per game more than the Cardinals did. The Cardinals won the league, National League, by in the range of 9 to 10 games, and so did the Detroit Tigers. So they both were runaway favorites to end up in the World Series in that year. Gibson and McLain won the Cy Young Award and the Most Valuable Player Award. The Cy Young Award, of course, is for the best pitcher, voted on by every year by the people who make that award. And the same thing for the most valuable player. So they won both. It's very unusual for a pitcher to win both the Cy Young. Of course, the Cy Young only goes to pitchers, and the most valuable player award goes to any of the players. Usually it goes to the home run hitter. Who were the stars in the World Series? Bob Gibson won 2 of the games. He struck out 17 batters, which is fantastic in game 1. The Cardinals had won the World Series the year before in 1967, and they had won it a few years before that. So they were seeking their 3rd World Series title within a matter of about 5 years. Mickey Lolich, which was pitcher, a left-hander for the Tigers, actually won 3 of the 4 games that the Tigers won, including the last one, which clinched the series. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Al Kaline, who at that point was 34 years old, that's getting into middle to old age for baseball, was inserted in the lineup by Mayo Smith. Mayo Smith was the manager for the Tigers, and he was considered a very innovative manager. Kaline was put in the lineup, even though he was kind of a utility player in his old age. So he wasn't one of the regulars in the outfield, but they decided they wanted his bat. He was famous, of course, for being a wonderful hitter. And so Mayo Smith made the decision to move Mickey Stanley to the infield, experimenting with this just before the World Series. A lot of people questioned his judgment on that, but they moved Mickey Stanley in to play the infield, and they put Al Kaline out there in the outfield. Well, Al Kaline came through. He hit .379, which is great. Had 11 hits, several home runs. Players for the Cardinals that were very famous were Curt Flood and Lou Brock. And they were famous for stealing bases. Lou Brock became one of the leaders of his time. He was one of the best until people like Rickey Henderson and others later on began to capture that title of the best base runner. But they had both Curt Flood and Lou Brock, who made the difference. He's around second base before you know it. The Tigers came from 3-1, 3 games to 1 down in game 5, and there's a story about game 5 we'll talk about in a minute, and then went off to St. Louis to finish the series, the World Series, and they won the 2 games in St. Louis. So the Cardinals were within a few outs, really, of winning the World Series in game 5. 2 of the great players of that era, Bob Gibson and Al Kaline, died this year. Bob Gibson was 84. In 1968, he won the Cy Young Award and was also not only the National League earned run average leader and the strikeout leader, but he won a Golden Glove. A Golden Glove is for the best fielding person at his position, and very few of those are given. So a remarkable accomplishment. He was the most valuable player, of course, as we mentioned before. He had a 22-9 record during the year. Through his whole career, from 1959 to 1975, they all were played with one team. That again was unusual, something that happened in the old days, but doesn't happen very much to anyone. Very, very few players stay on one team. He won 251 games, had a career 2.91 earned run average, struck out, those Ks are strikeouts, 3,117 batters over the course of his year. He pitched a no-hitter in 1971. He was also a very good basketball player. So out of high school, the Harlem Globetrotters recruited him. So he played his first year in 1957. That was before he got into baseball seriously with the Harlem Globetrotters. He led player civil rights movement back after he was involved in or early on, actually, in 1961. And with other players on the team, Curt Flood, of course, was also African-American, and Bill White was also. They began this whole movement of trying to have equality in the baseball field. And it was only until 1961 that they ended up being able to share the same clubhouse and the same hotels. In 1981, Bob Gibson was admitted to the Baseball Hall of Fame. Al Kaline died this year. He was known as Mr. Tiger. Again, he played only for the Tigers for 22 years, from 1953 to 1975. He was a rookie he was in the farm system before this in 53, 54, but 55, he won the batting title as a rookie at the age of 20 with an average of 3.40, 200 hits, 27 home runs, 102 RBIs. And he was the youngest player by one day to win the title. The other one being a Tiger also back in the 1907, I think it was, when Ty Cobb won it. 9 times he hit over 300. He had a lifetime batting average of 297, 3,007 hits. He was also a very good fielder. He played center field and right field, mostly right field in the end of his years, and won Golden Gloves, which is meaning he was one of the best players fielding wise on his position. Played in 15 All-Star games. And in 1968, at the age of 34 in the World Series, he hit 379, we mentioned before. 11 hits, 2 home runs, 8 RBIs. He was elected on the first ballot to the Hall of Fame, Baseball Hall of Fame in 1980. Later on, he was a sportscaster, and he became an official for the Detroit Tigers. His home, and of course, he was revered by fans in Detroit. Denny McLain. Let's look at some of the pictures here. Pitched for the Tigers only a few years, 63 to 70. In 1968, he won 31, lost 6, had an ERA just under 2, and was the most valuable player, and of course, Cy Young Award winner. First pitcher since Dizzy Dean in the early part of the 1900s to win 300 or more games. Dizzy Dean won 30, I've forgotten what year it was, I think in the 19-teens something. 30 games in 1968 for Danny. Won the Cy Young Award both in 98 and in 1969. After his career, he became a color commentator. He was also a gifted musician and a very outgoing fellow. He even went up and played the organ during the games he was pitching that was used in the stadium, and then subsequently had a career as an organist. Actually played in Las Vegas and several other places. He was not a huge hit, but quite a talented guy. He was brash, outspoken, controversial, and he actually got in trouble with the law and served time in prison for gambling and theft. So he never made it to the Hall of Fame. Mickey Lolich, much less celebrated at the time, pitched for the Tigers from 1963 to 75. In 1968, he was 17-9 during the season. But in the World Series, he was dominant. He won Game 2 and Game 5 and Game 7. He was also at the time in the National Guard. And of course, we had the war going on, and he was called up to the National Guard frequently, so he'd have to skip a couple of weeks here and a couple of weeks there during the season. So he wasn't able to pitch in his rotation every time that they wanted him to. Willie Horton, another player for the Tigers. One of the most respected and most popular players on the Tigers. In 1967, in many parts of the United States, but particularly in Detroit, they had race riots. Willie was one of those people that tried to restore peace in his neighborhood, 12th Street in Detroit. And he actually went out to the neighborhood where they were rioting and looting and stealing and making a mess. This is the blacks in Detroit. Got on top of a car in his tiger outfit and tried to calm everybody down. So he was given a lot of credit for trying to restore the peace. It was a big year for Willie. 1968, he hit more home runs than he did in any other year, 36. In the World Series, he was best remembered for his Game 5 throw from left field to catcher Bill Freehand to nip Lou Brock at the plate. Considered the turning point for the Tigers, who won that game and went on to win Game 6 and 7 and the World Series in St. Louis. That throw from center field on one bounce to Bill Freehand, the catcher, is captured as the cover of the book of Tim Weldon's book called The Summer of '68 that I said inspired my talk today. And that's Lou Brock. Now, Lou Brock was famous because of his speed for not sliding. He had gotten into the habit, because he was so fast, of crossing the plate standing up. So a very strange event took place at home plate there, where Bill Freehand blocked the plate. Lou Brock missed. His foot is just inches away from the plate there. If he touched that plate, he probably the St. Louis Cardinals would have gone on to win the game, win Game 5, and then would have captured their second World Series in a row. So that's a critical turning point. And the guy who threw the ball, not known for being a great fielder, but on this particular play, he said it was the greatest thing he ever did in baseball, was to throw out Lou Brock, one of the fastest men on the bases. Curt Flood, another great Cardinal player, was a center fielder for the Cardinals, one of the greatest of all time. Along with Lou Brock, they were considered the two best base stealers in the National League, and that was the heart of the character of the Cardinals. They were wonderful, making the most of singles and a few hits. In the year following this great season, 1969, he was traded, and he got into a contract dispute and became famous for his dislike of the system. And so he began what became much more common starting in that year, 1969, player protests. And eventually, of course, this led several years later to the whole concept of free agency. Now, the big difference with free agency, of course, is that the players had some say over where they ended up. And so that gave them negotiating power and the power to raise the price. Bob Gibson and Denny McLain thought that $100,000 a year, which was astronomical at the time in 1968, would have been a good place for them to be set for their salaries. And of course, subsequent to free agency, the price of the players began to skyrocket. And so now even a secondary member of a ball club will make over $1 million, and some of them have contracts of hundreds of millions of dollars, the better players. So free agency was a big deal, and it all started really with Curt Flood with his contract dispute in 1969 after he left the Cardinals. All right, let's look at a few other sports. In February, Peggy Fleming won the gold medal in Grenoble in France. She was the ladies singles champion. She had also won that same year the championship in Geneva. In 66 through 68, she was the world champion, and she turned professional in 1968 and performed extensively in the ice capades and elsewhere. I hope you remember Peggy Fleming. In the Summer Olympics, which took place many months later, they went to Mexico. It was the first Olympic Games to be staged in Latin America. The US won the most gold medals. The Summer Olympics was boycotted by about 20 African countries because the organizing committee admitted South Africa to the Games, and in protest, because of apartheid at the time, a number of African countries boycotted. 68 was the first to be staged in a Spanish-speaking country. It was the first to use a special all-weather track for track and field events. And of course, it was the Black Power salute that took place. Carlos and Smith won first and second place in the relays. They were from San Jose State, was it? San Jose State. They had three great runners that were on the Olympics, all from the same school. Football. 1968 was the second year of the Super Bowl, and the Green Bay Packers had won the first one, and they won the second one against the Oakland Raiders. Vince Lombardi was the coach. He died just in a short time later. And of course, today, the Vince Lombardi Trophy is the name of the trophy that is given to the winner of the Super Bowl. It was named in his honor in 1971. In college football in 1968, the Rose Bowl was played. At that time, there were very few bowl games. Rose Bowl was the big one. Ohio State, the best in the Big Ten, played the top of the Pacific League, and Ohio State beat Southern Cal 27-16. Ohio State was then ranked number 1. The NCAA championship game did not exist in the 20th century. One of the players most famous for that in that game in Southern Cal was O.J. Simpson, who became famous for a lot of other things, infamous many years later, but he was the star at that time. And so this was kind of a watershed year for football too, because the following year was Joe Namath played for the American Football League. They had the National Football League and the American Football League. They finally got the two to compete in Super Bowl I. National Football League was dominant, but in the third Super Bowl, Joe Namath actually pulled out a victory and gave a lot more credibility to the American Football League. So this was kind of a watershed period, if not just 68. It was that whole period, 67, 68, 69. In tennis, the open era, what it's called, the open era of tennis began. Back then, the US Open was played at Westside Tennis Club, Forest Hills, New York. American Arthur Ashe was ranked number 1 in the world in 1968. And during his career, Ashe was the first Black player to win the US Open, the Australian Open, but in the Wimbledon. He died in 1993 at the age of 49. In the men's US Open Championship in 1968, Arthur Ashe beat Tom Oker of the Netherlands in 5 sets. So 1968 was a big year. In the women's US Championship, Virginia Wade of Britain beat Billie Jean King in 2 sets. And of course, today, if you look at the US Open, they're played in the Billie Jean King National Championship Center. That center, the one in New York, where the US Open is held every year, fantastic facility, is named after Billie Jean King, who won many, many championships after losing to Virginia Wade in '68. The main venue for the final is called Arthur Ashe Stadium. So one of the parts of the Billie Jean King National Tennis Center is the Arthur Ashe Stadium. And so these 2 players in 1968 put their name on the tennis world. Muhammad Ali, 1968, he had already been an Olympic gold medalist as Cassius Clay, and then subsequently won the World Heavyweight Championship for many years. But by 1968 was the middle of the war, and so he became kind of the lightning rod. You can see the Esquire magazine there from 1968. He refused to be drafted into the war in Vietnam and became kind of a lightning rod for that, those for and against the war. He was stripped of his crown. He was convicted of a felony, and his case went to the Supreme Court, where they actually reversed the conviction 8-0. His daughter, Mariam, was born that same year. And during that year, he was very active in the anti-war protests. Love him or hate him, he becomes a weather vane for the political left and right. Another event that took place in '68 was the beginning of the Special Olympics. Eunice Kennedy Shriver organized, only weeks after her brother had been assassinated in 1968. It was a joint venture between the Kennedy Foundation and the Chicago Park Service, where they had the first Special Olympics at Soldier Field in Chicago. At that time, about 1,000 athletes from the US and Canada took part in a one-day event. Of course, today the Special Olympics involves many different sports and countries from all over the world. One of the winners was Loretta Claiborne, who was a marathoner, but she was also blind, and she managed to win the gold medal that year. So we have her face on there. The other thing that happened was that we went to the moon. And I don't know if we have a video here, but I think Alice or Shelby going to try to play something here that we can see a little clip from the Time magazine YouTube piece. Can
Yeah,
you try to
right.
play that?
Yeah, I have it. I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
And
And,
then, okay.
and I can take mine off, right?
Well, I think we're good. Let me pull this up.
Okay. Let's hope we can play it.
"40 years ago, we were ending perhaps the most turbulent year in the 20th century. The Democratic Convention had exploded into violence. 1,200 Americans were dying a month in Vietnam.
But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
We had just lost Martin Luther King. We had just lost Bobby Kennedy.
Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say why not.
And suddenly the year ended with this transcendent moment.
3, 2, 1, 0. We have liftoff.
No human eyes had ever seen the far side of the moon.
Houston, you are go for staging, over.
Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders were the three men aboard Apollo 8. These three men were the first humans to do it.
We didn't understand the significance of the mission until we got back home again. Then we understood the timing of it, the coincidence that we got around the moon at the particular time, the pictures that were taken, all got together into, I think, a very formidable and a very positive influence at the end of 1968 for the people of the United States.
Time was the first magazine that came out in a very broad way with the news that human beings were going to try to fly to the moon. And of course, in January, Borman, Lovell, and Anders were named as Time's Men of the Year. The most iconic picture in the history of space travel was Earthrise, as seen from the far side of the moon by the Apollo 8 astronauts. We could see for the first time how fragile, how destructible Earth is, and we could see it from 250,000 miles away.
The famous photo was taken by Bill Anders.
Yeah, I wouldn't let them touch a camera.
Looking back and seeing the Earth for the first time, and frankly, I lost all interest in the moon after that, and then focused back on the Earth, because it was the only place in the universe there was any color. We were away from home a long time, 240,000 miles, at Christmas Eve. I focused on the Earth.
For all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you.
Christmas Eve, 1968, Apollo 8 had one of its live broadcasts back to Earth.
We were told about 6 weeks before the flight that we would be having a TV broadcast with the largest audience in history, and the only instructions that we got from NASA was to do something appropriate. That struck a real chord with me because it showed that they had confidence in us.
They pointed the camera out the window and they showed Earthlings two things: our Earth from 250,000 miles away, and the surface of the moon rolling by underneath. We had never seen the likes of images like that, certainly not coming back live.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep.
They read aloud from Genesis, all three astronauts taking turns on Christmas Eve.
I must say, as I started it, it came to me really for the first time that this was a momentous thing.
And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day.
Sending three emissaries of the species this kind of distance, and then having them talk live to the rest of us, the species that sent them there, and convey something so transcendent as a verse about the creation of the species, whether you're religious or not. It transcended all of that and just brought people together in what was otherwise a very violent year.
And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8,
Good night, good luck, Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good Earth. This is the best crew that flew on Apollo. God bless y'all.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so anybody else have questions? I saw some baseball fans registering themselves. Anybody have any comments or questions? Unmute yourself. Let me know. It looks like everybody's muted there.
Alice, can you unmute everybody?
Okay, I just did.
Okay.
Ross, I got a question.
Okay. Yeah.
When did
Go ahead.
when did free agency go into effect?
I think it was 76.
Okay.
It took a few years to player unrest and the whole transformation of the owners telling you what to do. I mean, like slaves, you know. Baseball players just worked for the club, and once Curt Flood got unhappy with his contract, he was traded from this wonderful St. Louis Cardinal team. He didn't like it, and he started raising hackles with local people. So one thing led to another. It just went on for several years, and eventually the standard is, as it is now, is the player is in charge of himself. I mean, he basically can, if he can hit 300 or win 20 games, he can make millions. And it all started back then in the 70s.
Yeah, and then some other professional sports followed suit, right?
Exactly. Yeah, no, it happened about the same time. Everybody was becoming aware of it. Of course, this whole era of 68, you're old enough to remember the tumult and the problems and all the unease and the unrest politically, racially, everything. It was a watershed year for so many different things. So it all infected the sports world, and baseball was the one that ran the longest season throughout, all the way from April to October. So they were the ones in the forefront, but football got that too, and everybody else. So now today the price is you pay millions, whereas Bob Gibson thought he'd be great if he got $100,000, and he was the best they had.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions, other comments?
I just looked it up. The current system of free agency of Major League Service was agreed to July 12th, 1976.
Yeah, right.
And
So
then it,
1976.
yeah, it goes on to say, then the salary surge began.
Yes, exactly. Well, it was the players began to take charge of their own negotiating. They weren't just peons told what to do. So that's everything began in 68, well, actually 69, when Curt Flood started his little protest with his new team.
When did the designated hitters concept start? I think was
yeah. That came a few years after too. I think it was 75. In 69, of course, they expanded the leagues, American and National Leagues. They added 2 teams in those years. And then, you had these old players that were good, but couldn't play first base as well as they used to, and all that kind of thing. So they developed the designated hitter in the American League. And of course, I think it's the National League now, but the American League was different from the National League for up until very recently, having the designated hitter pitch. You would have a player that instead of the pitcher hitting, who usually was a weaker hitter, not always, but Bob Gibson was a good hitter, and actually Mickey Lolich, the one who won the 3 games from the World Series, he hit a home run in the World Series. I don't think he ever hit a home run before that, but occasionally you'd get a home run from a pitcher, but basically they wanted to put in somebody stronger. So that's when they developed the designated hitter. But the whole tone of things began to change in 1968. I think it was 75 that they instituted the designated hitter in the American League.
73.
73? Okay. Thank you, Colleen. You're doing Colleen fact check.
I was so disappointed. I remember I started hating the American League at that point. All my teams were in the
Who are you rooting for, Colleen?
Back then, let's see, in 73, I would have been rooting for the Phillies because they gave me 8
The Phillies. Oh, yeah. Uh-huh. How about you, Leon?
Well, not sure I can remember that far back, but
you got to remember who you're rooting for.
I grew up in the Midwest, and we had very limited television, and we could always get the St. Louis professional sports. So I grew up watching the Cardinals and the St. Louis Hawks, and of course, the only football team was the Green Bay Packers and the Chicago Bears. That's all we ever saw.
Yeah, that's right. And you probably were, even if you can't remember, I would guess you were a Cardinal fan.
Yeah, I wasn't so much a baseball fan back then because, but I do remember listening to the World Series on the radio quite often. And I'll tell you, sounds like, boy, it was never as good as it was in the good old days, but you remember some of the great pitchers, Don Drysdale and Whitey Ford and those people. They could really pitch.
Yeah. And the radio broadcasters became quite famous. For Detroit, it was Ernie Harwell. He was the voice of the Tigers for decades. And, people treated him like he was a member of the family. I mean, he was important. And you had, who am I thinking of? Anyway, the baseball announcers on the radio, and then they transitioned to TV later. They were part of your hometown and part of your family. They were so important. All of that changes, I mean, now we got so many different channels. You can watch 3 football games at the same time. I mean, it's hard to remember what it was like back then. Anything else? We got more?
Ross, have you ever read John Grisham's book about his family growing up being Cardinal fans? One of his novels?
Which one?
Yeah, I do remember reading one of the early ones. I think.
A painted house.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
They would listen to the radio at night on the porch, the baseball games. Yeah, I loved that.
7-year-old picking pots so he could
Shelby?
make enough money to get a jacket.
Yeah. What'd you say, Ross?
Shelby, is that one of the books you had for your book club?
No, I read it years ago, but I just loved it. It was my favorite all time of his books.
Yeah, I love that one too. Yeah, I'm glad you remembered that one. Yeah, I had forgotten which book it was, but I had read that too.
Yeah,
but it's been a long time ago.
Thanks, Leon.
Yeah, A Painted House. Yeah, that's great. What else? What are we missing here? Anyway, I did a course a couple years ago, basically that attachment that some of you may have printed out here, timeline for 1968, was a product that I produced when I did the course called 1968. And part of the reason that I did that was that my wife and I were married in that year. And we were in graduate school, Michigan State University, and we went off on scholarship funds to Africa for a year to do academic research. I was working on my doctorate in geography, and we went to Ghana, and Elaine went along with me, and she did a sociology paper, even though she's basically a musician. So we had a good time. And so 1968 kind of triggered everything, you know, when we were getting ready for our golden wedding anniversary. I said, well, we got to do some kind of a course on 1968. Too much happened back then. And of course, most of what happened in 1968 was when we were away in Africa. So we missed a lot of it firsthand. Okay, anything else?